There are moments in sports that stop you mid-scroll. Moments where you read a headline twice, put your phone down, and just sit with it for a second. This is one of those moments. Michael Jordan, the man who turned basketball into a global religion, who built a sneaker empire worth more than most professional sports franchises, who went from being a player to being an owner, reportedly extended an offer to Caitlin Clark that nobody in the sports world saw coming. Not the analysts. Not the insiders, not the league executives who spend their entire careers trying to predict the next big move. Jordan didn't offer her a campaign. He didn't slide a standard endorsement deal across the table with a check and a smile. What he put in front of Caitlin Clark was something far more significant. He offered her a seat at the ownership table, a real one. And if you want to understand why that matters, why this single conversation could ripple outward and reshape professional sports for the next generation, you have to understand both of these people, where they came from, what they built, and why when their paths crossed, something much bigger than basketball was set into motion. Most people know Michael Jordan the player, 6 championships, 5 MVP awards, the tongue, the shrug, the flu game, the shot over Byron Russell. The legacy is so enormous it almost feels fictional at this point, like a character someone invented to sell sneakers. But the version of Michael Jordan that matters most to this story isn't the one wearing number 23. It's the one sitting in the boardroom. After retiring, Jordan didn't quietly disappear into a life of golf courses and nostalgia tour. He became a businessman with a level of ambition that matched everything he showed on the court. The Jordan brand, which operates under Nike, has grown into one of the most powerful entities in all of sports marketing. We're talking about a label that generates over $5 billion in revenue annually. That number isn't a typo. $5 billion from a logo, from a story, from a legacy that Jordan carefully, intentionally, and strategically built over decades. He also became a franchise owner, purchasing a majority stake in the Charlotte Hornets and later selling that stake at a significant profit. His track record in the business of sports isn't just impressive, it's almost unreasonably consistent. So when a man like that picks up the phone and decides to make a move, people listen. And more importantly, people ask, why now, why her? If you've been anywhere near a sports conversation in the last 2 years, you already know the name. But let's slow down and actually look at what she did, because the numbers tell a story that even the most skeptical person has to respect. Caitlin Clark came into the WNBA as the most hyped rookie in the league's history. And unlike most cases where the hype outpaces the reality, Clark showed up and did something remarkable. She delivered. Then she delivered some more. Then she kept going until the entire sports media landscape had no choice but to pay attention. During her rookie season, Clark averaged over 20 points per game while also leading the league in assists. She wasn't just a scorer. She was a playmaker, a floor spacer, a player who made everyone around her better while simultaneously being the most dangerous offensive weapon on the floor. Arenas that had previously drawn modest crowds were suddenly selling out. Television ratings climbed to levels the WNBA hadn't seen in years. Games featuring Clark were averaging over 1 million viewers per broadcast, numbers that rival many NBA regular season matchups. Her jersey became one of the best-selling items in the entire league almost overnight. Her step-back three-pointer became the most talked-about shot in women's basketball. She was everywhere not because the media pushed her there artificially, but because she earned it every single time she walked onto the court. But here's the thing that separates Clark from other talented athletes who briefly capture the public's attention. Her impact wasn't just statistical, it was cultural. She changed the conversation around women's basketball at a fundamental level. People who had never watched a WNBA game before found themselves checking scores on their phones. Parents were buying tickets to take their daughters to games. Brands that had historically ignored women's basketball were suddenly calling agents and asking how they could get involved. That's not a coincidence, that's the Clark effect, and Michael Jordan noticed. Here's where a lot of coverage of this story goes wrong. People hear Michael Jordan offered Caitlin Clark a deal and they assume it's another endorsement situation. Another logo on a jersey, another commercial shoot, another social media campaign. That's not what this is. What Jordan reportedly put on the table is something with far more long-term significance, a path toward ownership, a stake in the actual business of the sport, not just the performance of it. Think about what that means for a second. Throughout the entire history of professional sports, the structure has been remarkably consistent. Owners sit at the top. Players produce value on the floor. Owners capture the majority of that value financially. Players earn salaries, sometimes enormous ones, but they are ultimately employees within a system they don't control. Jordan lived that reality. He was the most valuable player in the world for over a decade, and even with his talent and his commercial appeal, he was still working within boundaries set by owners and league executives. It wasn't until after his playing career that he was able to truly build wealth and influence on his own terms. What he's offering Clark is the opportunity to skip that waiting period, to move directly from player to power broker while she's still at the peak of her influence and visibility. From a business perspective, the timing is intentional. Clark is at a point in her career where her name carries enormous cultural weight. Every business decision she makes right now, every partnership she forms, every institution she aligns herself with gets amplified by that weight. Jordan understands this because he lived it. He knows that the window to make transformational moves doesn't stay open forever, and the smartest thing a legendary athlete can do is walk through that window before it closes. Let's talk about why the concept of player ownership is significant beyond just this one story. Professional sports leagues have always operated on a fairly simple premise. Talent creates value and ownership captures it. The players are the product. The owners profit from the product. And while collective bargaining agreements have gradually improved conditions for athletes over the decades, the fundamental power structure has remained largely unchanged. Player ownership disrupts that structure in a meaningful way. When an athlete holds equity in a franchise, their incentives shift completely. They're no longer just focused on their own performance and their own contract. They're invested in the long-term health and success of the entire organization. They care about ticket sales, broadcast deals, merchandise revenue, and the fan experience in a way that a salaried player simply doesn't have to. More importantly, it creates a pathway for athletes to build generational wealth that doesn't disappear when their playing career ends. The career of a professional athlete is short. Even the greatest players in history have had to figure out what comes next when the game is done. Ownership provides an answer to that question that goes far beyond the typical post-career options of broadcasting, coaching, or brand partnerships. And in the context of women's sports specifically, this matters even more. WNBA salaries, while growing, are still significantly lower than NBA salaries. The average player has a shorter window to accumulate financial security. If Clark were to successfully navigate a path to franchise ownership, she would be setting a precedent that every female athlete in every league would be able to point to and say, "This is what's possible." That's not a small thing. That's a blueprint. You can't talk about the story without talking about Nike, because any partnership between Jordan and Clark doesn't exist in isolation. It exists within the enormous commercial infrastructure that Jordan has helped build over the last 4 decades. The Jordan brand is one of the most recognizable commercial identities in the world. It's not just a shoe company, it's a storytelling machine. When the Jumpman logo appears on something, it carries a narrative weight that most brands spend billions of dollars trying to achieve and never quite get there. It says, excellence, legacy, winning. Nike has also been making significant investments in women's sports over the last several years, and not just out of a desire to be on the right side of history. They are tracking the data. Viewership numbers for women's sports have been climbing steadily. Merchandise sales for female athletes have outpaced projections. The engagement numbers on social media content featuring women's basketball are in many cases stronger than comparable NBA content. The business case is there and Nike sees it. If Clark were to develop a signature shoe line under the Jordan brand, the cultural implications would be significant. We're talking about the first female athlete to have a true Jordan signature, a product that connects her story directly to one of the most storied legacies in sports history. Every young girl who laces up those shoes would be carrying something more than footwear. She'd be carrying a story about what's possible. And for Jordan, this is precisely the kind of move that extends the brand's relevance into the next generation. The original Jordan mystique was built on the story of a player who refused to lose, who willed himself into greatness, who turned talent into transcendence. Clark's story rhymes with that in important ways. She came into a league that many people underestimated, and she made them pay attention. She did it on her own terms, with a style of play that was uniquely her own. The narrative writes itself, and Jordan Brand has always known how to tell a great narrative. Here's what's worth watching as this story develops. The WNBA's current ownership structure was not designed with player ownership in mind. The league, like most professional sports organizations, operates on a model where franchise ownership is kept separate from player participation. If Clark and Jordan are serious about pursuing this path, there will be structural and regulatory conversations that need to happen at the league level. That's not necessarily a deal-breaker, it's a challenge. And challenges of this kind have been navigated before in professional sports. What usually makes the difference is whether the people pushing for change have enough leverage and credibility to force the conversation. With Jordan's resources and Clark's cultural momentum, they arguably have both. There will also be the inevitable pushback. Anytime someone proposes a significant shift to an established power structure, the people who benefit most from that structure push back. It will be framed as premature or unrealistic or bad for competitive balance, or any number of other objections that obscure the real concern, that the people who currently hold power might have to share some of it. But here's the thing about pushback. It's often the clearest signal that something important is happening. The most significant shifts in sports history, integration, free agency, revenue sharing, nil rights for college athletes, all faced enormous resistance before they became accepted reality. The resistance wasn't a sign that the idea was wrong. It was a sign that the idea had real weight. Step back from the specific details of this deal for a moment and look at what it represents at the highest level. Women's sports have spent decades being told in various explicit and implicit ways that they are secondary, smaller audiences, lower ratings, less commercial value, less cultural significance. The messaging was so consistent and so pervasive that it became a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Less investment led to less infrastructure, which led to less visibility, which was then used to justify less investment. Caitlin Clark broke that cycle. She brought visibility to the WNBA on a scale the league hadn't seen before, and she did it by simply playing basketball at an extraordinary level in a way that resonated with an enormous audience. She didn't rewrite the rules by asking permission. She rewrote them by making them irrelevant. And now the most successful businessman in basketball history is looking at what she's built and saying, I want to be part of this. I want to help take it further. That is the real story here. Not the specific terms of any deal, not the exact structure of any ownership arrangement. It's the fact that we've reached a moment where the case for women's sports doesn't need to be argued anymore. It just needs to be funded. Michael Jordan, a man who has never been known for making sentimental decisions, looked at the landscape of women's basketball and saw an investment opportunity. That tells you everything. There's a version of this story that gets written as pure hype. Jordan and Clark, a legendary duo, changing the game forever, etc. And look, the hype isn't entirely unjustified. This is genuinely significant, but the more important version of the story is quieter and more durable. It's about two people at very different stages of their careers who both understand that the most powerful thing an athlete can build isn't a stat line or a highlight reel. It's a legacy that outlasts the game itself. Jordan built that. It took him decades and an enormous amount of intentional effort. Clark is just getting started, and if this partnership is everything it appears to be, she might not need decades at all. What do you think? Is player ownership the future of women's sports? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this kind of deep dive storytelling is your thing, subscribe to Simply Explained and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload.